The Wood Whisperer is sponsored by Woodcraft. Just get started. Welcome to another episode of Ask TWW, where you guys ask the questions and I do my best to answer them. Today's topics include pros and cons of having a home shop versus a commercial space, how to make Kapla blocks, what to expect from table saw cuts, the best way to remove dried glue from clamps, and the truth about acoustic panels in your workspace. Let's dive in. Martar3392 asks, what are the pros and cons of having a shop away from home? My business has outgrown my tiny basement shop and I'm considering renting a space about 15 minutes away. I like the idea, but I worry about losing the convenience. How has that transition been for you? Now this is tricky because some things can be both a pro and a con, just depending on your perspective. So I'm gonna throw a bunch of stuff at you and hopefully it'll give you some food for thought. You didn't mention kids, but that's gonna factor heavily into my own perspective. When my kids still had that new baby smell, the home shop was a lifesaver. As they hit elementary school age, things shifted and the shop kind of became a little bit more of a distraction. I started valuing my family time a lot more and I wanted a cleaner separation between work and home. With my current commercial shop that's about 10 minutes away from my house, there are days where I'd rather not have to drive to work, especially during a recent snowstorm. So today my kids are in that preteen phase of life and I find myself with a little bit more time in the evenings. It would be great to just pop in the shop for a quick glue up or an extra coat of finish. But that 10-minute drive is enough of a deterrent that it honestly never happens. Another convenience issue that you should consider is home projects. When your shop is at home, your tools are all right there. When it's not, every DIY project kind of turns into a hassle, either hauling tools back and forth or buying duplicates. Now let's hit some of the practical stuff. In your basement, rent is free, utilities are bundled, and there's no commute. With a commercial space, you start every month in the red and you've got to earn your way out of the hole. Insurance is another big one. Most people running a basement shop probably don't have the right coverage. So if a fire starts in the shop, it's very unlikely that your homeowner's insurance will fully cover it. A separate shop does mean additional insurance costs, but it also means a much cleaner separation between home and business assets. Another thing to think about is security. A rented building means you got to be thinking about things like alarms, monitoring, just protecting your tools and your inventory. Now, from a client perspective, a standalone shop makes a much stronger impression. It feels more professional, and you can be comfortable having clients and guests come by whenever needed. And finally, let's talk a little bit about growth, because a basement shop can only take you so far. A commercial space gives you more room for tools, a better workflow, and maybe even employees down the road. So overall, moving the shop away from home was the right call for me. I gained clarity, some room to grow, a healthier boundary between work and home life, even though it definitely does come with some real trade-offs. Sanyashova 2887 asks, I want to turn leftover wood into Kapla-style planks for my kids. They have very specific dimensions and ratios, 117 by 23.4 by 7.8 millimeters. I've got a joiner, a planer, table saw, bandsaw, and basic tools, but no drum sander. What tools would you use, and what order of operations would you recommend? Now, I actually got excited because I thought for a minute we were talking Klingon here. Kapla! But alas, it's Dutch. Anyway, I could tell you the steps that I'd take, but I think it's going to be a little bit better if I just show you. I'll start with a piece of 4/4 poplar. The method for making these really isn't all that different than what I might do if I were cutting edge banding for plywood. Now, even though I have a crazy planer that's got a digital readout and I could switch it to metric, I'm keeping it on imperial just to show you how you might approach this with a regular planer by sneaking up on the measurement. Calipers are obviously your friend here. Even a basic lunchbox planer should allow you to bump the handle slightly and make these little baby passes. Now I'm going to keep mine slightly oversized because if I try to nail it perfectly, there's a real good chance that I'm going to overshoot the target. You said you don't have a drum sander, but honestly that wouldn't be the tool that I'd use to dial in a precise thickness anyway. Instead, I'll use my Wood River smoothing plane. With pencil line on the surface, I can take a few light passes, checking the thickness as I go. Once I'm at the point that I think another pass would take me too far, I could use a sanding block to do the final surface smoothing and then test one more time. I think that's pretty darn close. Now we can use the bandsaw to cut these into 7.8 millimeter strips. I'll make sure they're oversized so that we have some material to remove at the planer. Planing these is the same process that we used for the full width board. Just sneak up on it and stop just short of the target. Then it's back to the workbench for some more hot smoothing action. Finally, we have the length cut. For this, I'll use a stop block at the miter saw. While I have these nice micro-adjusting stops I would normally use, I'm going to assume that you don't have them. So when I need to sneak up on a cut, I just put a pencil line by the stop and then simply nudge the block over until it covers the line. That moves the stop about 1/2 millimeter. And when one of my scrap pieces finally hits 117, I can batch out the rest of the blocks. Now, of course, if you're making a lot of these, you have to apply the batching processing sort of methodology, run all your parts through each part of the process so that when you're done, they're all exactly the same. And by the end of it, however many you need to make, you should have them all dialed in pretty well. Just playing with these for a little bit, these are pretty cool. I wish I had these when my kids were younger. They're a perfect 15 to 3 to 1 ratio, which means you could stack them in all sorts of ways because they just kind of match up. Right? And that's why the measurements are so important, so that if you're building a larger thing, that's where the errors will come out as you sort of stack these pieces. So, Kapla! So you guys know that I love answering your woodworking questions, but sometimes there's really nothing better than talking to someone in person, and that's where your local Woodcraft store comes in. Just go to Woodcraft's store locator to find your local store. Whether you're stuck on joinery, finishes, or tool choices, you could walk in and get real hands-on advice. Even better, most locations host classes, demos, and events so you can keep learning and meet other woodworkers. And while you're at it, you could save 10% using our code TWW2026. Of course, exclusions apply. Thanks Woodcraft for sponsoring the show. Let's get back to our questions. Patreon supporter Chad Green asked, in your greeting card holder video, you mentioned cleaning up table saw mill marks with a smoother. I always thought your table saw cuts were glue ready. Is this your usual process? And would you consider showing the kinds of mill marks you typically get off the saw? So first thing I want to clarify here, Chad, is you say glue ready. Glue ready and finish ready are two different things. Pretty much any power tool in my shop will produce a surface that's glue ready. But is it a surface that is clean enough and smooth enough to be ready for finish? That's a different story. So I think what you probably meant was finish ready. Let me show you a couple of cuts from various tools and we can see, are they actually ready for finish or do they need some more post-processing? All right, I turned the shop lights off. I think it might help with the visibility here. You can see on the bandsaw surface, that is pretty rough, right? Not all bandsaws will be that rough. It really is a question of how sharp your blade is, your calibration. But this is what I would definitely call not finish ready. This is also not glue ready. I would definitely be doing some post-processing before I put that into some kind of a glue up. All right, let's flip it over and look at the jointed surface. This one is quite a bit better, certainly glue ready, but I would not call that finish ready. If the light catches it just right, you should see a bunch of stripes there. I've got a helical head on my jointer, and that is a really smooth cut, but when you put finish on there, that striping is absolutely going to be noticeable. So not finish ready. Let's rotate to the other side. This is my planer. Now my planer is also a helical head cutter, but it's a bit higher quality than what I have on the jointer, and this one's a little bit debatable. There's certainly flaws in the surface that could be helped with scraping, planing, or sanding, but one might just throw finish on that and be okay with it. Personally, I would give it a little bit more love before completing my project, but you know, the surface is pretty darn good, just not absolutely perfect. And then finally, to your question specifically, the table saw. Well, you know, the table saw just kind of depends. It depends on the sharpness of the blade, it depends on the configuration of the tool, but ultimately, you're almost always going to get some kind of lines in the surface at the table saw that are not finish ready. Could I glue it? Totally, absolutely glue ready. But is it ready to apply finish and send out the door? Nope. To kind of drive home the point, here is an example that's been finished, right? And if you take a close look, if I can get just the right angle for you, you should see those stripes. They make their way into the final piece, and finish does nothing but highlight them, right? What that should look like is this. On this side, it's already been processed after it was machined. It got a little bit more work done, just a little bit of sanding, doesn't take too much, but that makes a big difference in the final product. So this is what we're trying to avoid. Now, of course, you got to remember, everybody's shop is a little bit different. The quality of your tools might be different, even the sharpness of your blades. And don't forget, calibration is huge. Tools behave better when they're well calibrated, and cut quality can suffer if they're not. So there are just so many variables at play, but if we're speaking very generally, if it comes off a power tool, I don't consider it finish ready, but I do consider it glue ready. In the case of the bandsaw here, I need a new blade. Normally my bandsaw cut is a lot cleaner than that. Ed asks, what's the best way to remove dried glue from your clamps? Well, first, we all know that prevention is better than a cure, so make sure that your clamp bars are waxed. And if you really want to be super diligent, you can always lay down paper over the bars or even run strips of tape across them whenever you do a glue up. I'll be honest, I never do that. Thankfully, glue just kind of pops right off with a putty knife because my bars are waxed. Now for the stuff that's a little bit more stubborn, there are a lot of caustic chemicals that you can use that will loosen up the glue. But a fairly harmless chemical that you can use that you'll probably already have is vinegar. Here I have some clamps that I covered in glue intentionally just for this demo. Now you could do one of two things. You could wrap the bar in a rag and then soak that rag in vinegar and let it sit. Or if you're real serious about this method, you could make yourself a reusable PVC pipe bath. Fill it with vinegar and let the bar soak. Now in both cases, the vinegar should soften the glue up enough that you can easily just scrape it away. Just a word of warning, the vinegar will dull the finish on shiny bars such as the ones from Jet. And of course, if you hate the smell of vinegar, this might not be the method for you. I happen to love the smell of vinegar, or eating vinegar in any form. It's fantastic. I really don't mind the smell. And finally, Jeff asks, question about household sanity. My basement workshop has an insulated ceiling which helps with soundproofing, but the concrete walls still reflect a lot of noise. I've noticed acoustic panels in some of your videos. How do you determine where to place them, and what's the best way to reduce noise in a dusty shop with concrete walls? Well, first of all, household sanity? You may have come to the wrong place. But to answer your question, there is a bit of rhyme and reason to the whole acoustic panel thing. Now I know Jeff understands this, but anyone else that might be new to room acoustics might not realize that putting acoustic treatments on your walls does very little for soundproofing. Acoustic panels, like the ones that I have in my shop, they do absorb medium and high frequency sounds that prevent them from reverberating around the space. Thanks to these panels, my videos actually sound quite a bit better and the space feels, for lack of a better word, calmer. And anyone who's been here and actually visited the shop can probably attest to it just kind of feels like a nice space to be in and have a conversation. But in order to actually block sound from getting out of the space, we have to talk about things like transmission and decoupling, which really isn't what Jeff asked about, so we'll save that for another time. Now, I actually do have a full video that shows you how to make acoustic panels, and it goes into a lot more detail. I'll just hit the basics here. When it comes to acoustic panels, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, you want to make sure that you use a decent sound-absorbing material. Stuff I went with is 2-inch thick rock wool insulation panels. I then wrap them with acoustically transparent fabric for a cleaner look. Second, you want to mount them with an air gap. Now, I won't go into the science behind it, but if you can keep that air gap about the size of the thickness of the panel, you'll get better results, especially in that lower frequency range. My panels are actually hung from the ceiling, so this was pretty easy for me to do. Third, and this one I'm not 100% sure how much of a difference it really makes, is to stagger your panels. This way, if a sound wave hits the concrete wall on one side, there's going to be a panel directly on the other wall to absorb that reflection. Again, if you want more information on all this, check out my video on making acoustic panels. So that's going to do it for us today. If you want your questions answered by me, all you have to do is join the membership area here on YouTube or head to patreon.com/woodwhisperer. Now, I ask for questions every week, and while I answer all of them, I sometimes cherry pick a few to feature on this show. So thanks to our supporting members for helping us keep the dream alive. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time. That was easy enough. Bop, 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 bop. Got to get it all out. We're going to do it. It's going to happen. Pretty sure.